early 1970s, there was definitely a different approach then, yeah? And in many ways, it kind of seemed a lot better, an approach, you know? Let's be honest, it seemed like, I kind of think, you know, we all know about Batabi Joyce now, and, you know, that's all old stuff, isn't it? But, you know, nevertheless, I kind of feel he started off good and kind of got a bit worse over time, you know, like, and a lot of it was just the corruption, not, you know, I'm not in any way defending Joyce, but a lot of it was the corruption of what happens when you've got money and power, you know, and a lot of people started coming to Mysore, and he kind of realised quite quickly on that he was onto something, and the trouble was that he had a small room of 8 or 10 people, and a lot of the practice then started to get compressed, so more and more people could come through, otherwise there was just no way to kind of cope with the numbers that were in Mysore. So think that he had a shala at first in Lakshmipuram that catered for 8 people, and at that time when the first Westerners came, because there were someone that came to, I mean, the first person that came to see Batabi Joyce was this guy, Andrew van Lisbeth, and Andrew van Lisbeth's a Belgian guy who wrote a book called, I think it was called like, funny like, it was in French, it was like, je prends le yoga. I learn yoga. And I kind of like the title for simplicity, really. So, and in the back, he listed Batabi Joyce as one of his teachers. This is in the 1960s, late 60s, but he never really studied much with Batabi Joyce. Basically, one reason probably was, in the end, I found out through David Williams that when David Williams came to Mysore, was inquiring about Batabi Joyce's whereabouts, where was this guy? And, you know, at the time, Mysore was quite a small town, you know, and people would say, oh, that way, that it was literally like that, you know. And, and he said, one woman said to him, oh, don't go there, he broke the last Westerner's leg, you know. Mysore adjustments, you know, never had a good start, really. Anyway, so there's probably one reason why Andrew van Lisbeth never ended up studying that much with Joyce, and nevertheless, he was the kind of first Westerner probably to learn with Batabi Joyce. The first Western to learn the method of Krishnamacharya, because of course Krishnamacharya was Ashtanga, was the kind of teacher of Batabi Joyce. The Krishnamacharya taught Indra Devi in the I suppose we could say she was Russian, she was of mixed backgrounds, but so that was in the 1920s, so she was probably the first Western to learn what might be considered the Krishnamacharya teaching, but the first Western to learn Ashtanga was Andrew van Lisbeth, potentially, but in the actuality he didn't end up teaching it or really studying it past that time that he learnt a little bit in India with Batabi Joyce and many other teachers. So nevertheless, we come to 1973, I think. You can read this in David Williams' book if you want to. David Williams has got this very large book, My Journey to My Story of Yoga or something like that. And you can buy it from his website. The problem is it's very bloody heavy. The book weighs about 10 kilos and it costs more to ship than it does to buy. So ended up having to buy a few of these in order to get interviewed. I shouldn't say it's probably, but in order in order that we could interview him, I had to buy like 5 copies or something. We had to get them shipped. It cost us a fortune because the book is so bloody heavy, you could use it as a mortal weapon. But anyways, the book is great, and they've got his whole story of how he goes overland. The first Westerners, they travelled overland and they caught the bus in Istanbul from the pie shop. I think it was called something like that. I think it's called a pie shop, and it was a famous bus, the magic bus, and it goes over Afghanistan and I think and then down through India, and they went overland like that. So him and Nancy Gilgoff, his girlfriend at the time, arrived in 1973 or something, and they learnt from Batabi Joyce the sequences 1 and 2 in 3 months, both of them, And that's not to say they learnt them perfectly. Again, this is a big difference between then and now. They learnt the way that I was suggesting. They go through the whole lot, muddle through, leave the hard ones out, approximise some, modify some, and gradually pull them into order. It seems to me a fair way to do anything. So that's one of my big gripes, I suppose, about the way that it's evolved now into a homogenized system, when in the first place it certainly wasn't anything like that way. I mean, if you think David Williams was a 20-something young athletic American, and he was quite able, somewhat able. I don't know. You look at these posture charts, I'm not sure I necessarily fully agree with that. Some of the postures are a bit dodgy looking, but nevertheless, he was to modern standards, because they were expressing the postures in a much more kind of, I don't know how to say this, less precise, less anal way than is done now, let's say. You know, it was much more a kind of try the posture, see how it works for your body. There was no certain guidelines. It wasn't like the hand has to be exactly here, you have to be in a straight line, you have to be like this. It was much more like, oh yeah, okay, Tittabhasana, you know, you try the next one, you know. And what I wanted to say specifically was Nancy Gilgoff, his girlfriend, had come suffering chronic migraines. And she was taught by Batabi Joyce a kind of remedial version of Ashtanga, which so the protocol, the precedent is there in the first place. She was taught the series 1 and 2, again, the primary and the intermediate series as they're known now, with the hard ones left out. And Batabi Joyce used to hold me in every posture. I couldn't do any of them, I was so weak. He used to hold me through every single posture, you know. And she got through, you know, like that. And now if you went to Mysore, or many of the Ashtanga teachers, the way they're teaching now is you can't do a posture, so you're stopped, you know. So I go some places and I see like some stiff guys coming in, they've got 10-minute practices, you know, because literally, like they do sun salutations, they lie down because they're not allowed to go any further, you know. It seems, I mean, you may laugh, but you know, it's funny, you know, I agree, it's funny, but it's not funny as well, right? Because you know, it's not helpful for the bodies, you know, and the saddest thing is that it puts people off in the end. You know, after a few months they think, well, this yoga, come on now, you know, I'm never going to get anywhere with it, you know, I've got this practice which is pretty boring, to be honest, I've got 10 movements involved in it, you know, how is that going to help my body? Or, you know, so they quit, you know, and that's the biggest, I think, drawback of this, is that you just want to keep people on program as long enough, like I'm telling you, with the shapes and with the progressions, and that's why the sequences are kind of useful, because they're like carrot and the donkey, you know, you need the carrot as long as you need the carrot, and the sequences kind of give you a way to roll, you know. And you know, I needed them for many years. You're ambitious, you want the postures, until you realise the postures are not really the thing in the end anyway, you know. But they kind of give you a focal point. Nevertheless, this stopping people in postures, most unhelpful, most detrimental, never was the way in the first place. So it's sad that it's creeped in that way, and that, you know, from what was a, you know, because also you remember that the sequences when they were first given to people, like when David Williams got the sequence and Nancy got them, it was all oral. No one had a, you know, they didn't have a way to communicate it. No one had taken photos of all. Later on it came the photos and David Williams' chart, but he didn't release that till the 90s. And before that, what he gave to his students when he went away, when he went back from India and started teaching, he just gave them a list, you know, the postures, because Patabi Joyce had the list of the sequences printed out on his wall in his home, and it was in his home that he taught for originally. He was teaching in his front room, and he had the list of his what he called his yoga curriculum, and they were just printed on his wall, you know, like. But that leaves a great deal of discrepancy. If you can imagine, a list is not the same as the detailed visual representation of the posture, right? So what comes later on is the visual charts, and then it's like, well, the posture is done this way, this is the way Patabi Joyce does it, or Sharat does it, you know, and you see that you start to get the visual representation, you know? But even then, if you look at the way that, you know, if you look at Sharat's primary series, it doesn't look exactly like some, you know, a modern Ashtanga teacher's primary series, right? So you see there is a lot of variance in interpretation, but and sadly it's become more and more homogenized, and obviously the people that are printing the list, they're the so-called best at it, aren't they? So you're getting the kind of, you know, 0.1% of the best, most adept gymnastic versions of the posture, and not just the natural body. You know, if you kind of gave everyone a posture to do, right, and we put the postures sheets together with everyone in the class doing one of the postures, you know, they probably wouldn't look like the list of Keno McGregor's you know, primary series sheets, you know, but that will be the natural representation of the way that the postures are done, you know. So you see the homogenization crept in gradually, and originally, because of the way it was, and because there was only a few people in the room, he could teach one-to-one, you know. He taught David Williams one thing, he taught Nancy the other thing. And the second thing to recognise is that he didn't teach the primary series and the second series like they are today. They were all one series, right? They didn't even know that there were two series, which only makes sense. You know, I think if you're teaching, or even if you're learning, do the primary and then some of the second. At least the backbend second series ones, you know, you've got a few good backbends up to camel posture. You should put them in and help with your backbend. You see that backbend we do at the end of the primary now, that was at the end of the second series. So because of time, I told you time, and in the end money, and power, sadly, I think, that he tried to get more and more people to come, shorten things down, you know, squash things together. In the end, you had the primary series with the backbend at the end. Whereas originally, they would, you know, you wouldn't do the backbends until you'd done most of the second series, and then you would start maybe doing some of the backbends, you know. They came much later, you know. They didn't do Urdhva once they'd done primary at all. That wasn't in it. They didn't learn shoulder stand and headstand until they'd done primary series, until they completed primary series. Didn't do shoulder stand and headstand. It's very, if it doesn't hurt your neck, it's very important that you keep this part clear, because as you know, when you get stressed or you get, any trauma, it goes to the neck, yeah? So this part is the reason for the closing sequence, to keep the neck clear, to keep this part of the throat relaxed. It's very important. So you see that those subtle postures of the last primary series, they weren't taught until much later for people, right? Even if they could do them with the neck, and a lot of us nowadays have neck trouble anyway, so they're not relevant even structurally. But things were taught much more gradually and much more sensibly in lots of ways, right? They were certainly taught kind of a lot less vinyasas, as I mentioned before. They weren't taught to jump through between posture sides, never. And they weren't taught to jump back and through every posture, just through groups of postures. So there were a lot less vinyasas. Another thing was it wasn't competitive in such a way that Kamasana was done with the legs bent and Supta Kamasana was done with the legs crossed in front of the head, not the neck. Lots of these things that you see now, or the lifts, and all the jumps with the lifting up, there was a much more low bar, let's say. But because of the Westerners coming, things got pushed up as they got competing against each other, and the Ashtanga series and the demand became higher, let's say. And originally it was like, if you do it a little bit sloppy, that was fine. In fact, Pattabhi Jois used to say, he used to advise people, up until fairly recently, to be sloppy in it until they started advanced series, because you don't really know what you're doing. So if you don't really know what you're doing, obviously you don't push. If you're not exactly sure what's going on, it's best not just to get into your car and floor it until you really know how the car works. So you say just practicing a bit sloppy until you've done it a number of years, until you're on to advanced series, and then you can just, make it a little bit more demanding of yourself, but, just keep it all a bit laissez-faire, But, he was also encouraging students, and he was very keen to encourage, people to do more, and he would give extra postures and extra handstands, and it was very kind of like that at the start. There was a spirit of fun, and when David Williams was the first teacher, really, to teach back at home, he came back, and they went to Hawaii, because that was kind of the place where you'd go as an American at the time, I think, it was like Byron at the time, I guess, They all went down to Hawaii with all their mates, and there was Danny Paradise and David Williams and a number of other teachers you might know, and they used to just have fun and learn off each other, and after you'd done the series, the last posture you'd do, where David Williams would take everyone around the room on their hands. He would hold the legs, you'd walk around the room in your hands, So the stricture and the strictness and the kind of the rules of the Mysore, I suppose what I want to say is they come a lot later, and they're not really part of the traditional per se, when people say, well, that's not traditional, it's like, well, actually, that's more traditional in a way than the modern tradition, which is a more recent phenomenon, really, And as I say, that comes through numbers, through having to squash the series together. I mean, originally another example of this was there was 2 advanced series, Now that they've been divided to advanced A, B, C, D. Well, forget most of them, They're insane. But, the advanced A and B, I've worked at both myself. I've not completed completed advanced A in Mysore. I never completed advanced B in Mysore. But they're actually unrelatable, really. They're crazy in themselves, but they're pretty intense. But the reason why they got divided was because of time as well. So originally the student would do advanced A and advanced B, but no one could get through a whole series because they were too long. So in order that they could do a one series, they got divided into 4. So a student could come in and again and have an hour and a half practice, not a 3-hour practice, When people like, you might know Dina Kingsburg, she's a native of Australia. So when she went to Mysore, for example, she was doing the old advanced A, and she used to tell me in the podcast, and when I talked to her, her practice would be 4 hours, and that just wasn't really economically viable for Pattabhi Jois. Well, it was. He didn't need the money, but he wanted more people, more money, more fame, more glory. So he tried to get people to shorten things and get through quicker and quicker. And then sadly, that maybe it doesn't happen so much now because they've moved to a bigger premises. But in my experience of the old, there's 3 places that they moved. The first one was Joyce's living room in Lakshmipuram. The second was Gokulam, which I practiced with Teresa mainly in. And the third one is the new place for the last 4 years, which is the big airport hangar that he's built, Sharat Joyce, outside of town in Mysore. Now, and that one's a big one, and I think probably people aren't so rushed. But even in my time, I kind of feel, to be honest, that I was rewarded and given more of the series and blah, blah, blah I got through for doing it as quick as possible. I used to do the whole thing in an hour, just to get through, and he liked it. I think he liked it, and he gave me more postures because I wasn't hanging around, That was really the spirit of it, If you could do it quicker, that was better, If you would just rush them, And so it's sad in a way because, you lose a lot of precision and you lose a lot of breathing through just doing it so like that. But anyways, there's reasons, and oftentimes, unfortunately, a lot of our dictates, a lot of our social life conditioning and the way that we are is determined by economic and commercial factors in the end, the way that we live. So the same with the yoga, the way it's formulated now, the way it's shaped, a lot to do with that. And the same thing of, get the details right. If you don't do it like this, you're not doing proper Ashtanga. A lot of that was simply a teacher comes back from Mysore, right? Imagine it. Everyone's been to Mysore maybe now, but still not, So you come back and you're like, well, I've been to Mysore, I know the details. And that teacher practices Ashtanga, teaches it, but they haven't been, so they don't know the details. So it becomes like that kind of protection of your business. Like, you've been to Mysore, you know the way, it's this number of vinyasas. Everything becomes kind of somewhat like that because it's just like promoting yourself. I've been to Mysore, I know the exact way that it's done in Mysore, So it becomes more litigious like that to protect it. And the Joyce family did it as well because they felt, rightly so in some respects, that everyone was coming up with their own series, here, there and everywhere. So they wanted to make Ashtanga and keep it the way that Joyce wanted it, So they were started to become more rigorous and meticulous around the doing a posture the certain way, Now, one of my early teachers was John Scott, and his teacher was Derek Ireland. He was a famous teacher in Europe, not here, but he was famous in Europe. No one knows of him anymore. And he was given the splits, for example, between the Prasaritas. Patabi Joyce encouraged him to go and do the splits. So John Scott for many years taught the splits between the Prasaritas. The reason was that Derek Ireland had very tight thighs and hamstrings because he was a professional football player in his early youth. He played for Norwich, if you know anything about England. So he was a professional player. Norwich is not a bad team. At the time, they were maybe doing a bit better than now. So he was given those things, and other people were given different things. Graham Northfield, another native to Australia, was given certain things. I'm hoping to speak to Graham soon on a podcast, so watch out for that one. They were all given different things, but that became less and less possible over time due to numbers and due to the fact that you have to keep it a certain way. If you've got a certain number of people, it's like, you can't just start to, you have to pull it in a little bit, rein it in a bit, And certainly you've got a certain number of the room in the room, and everyone can't be doing a little bit their own thing. When you've got over 70 people, you have to say this is the way it's done, and you just have to do it this way, So, yes, I want to say that, I think that originally that it was inferred and accepted and encouraged that the blueprint was there, but the variation was there for the individuals to understand the blueprint, right? When Krishnamacharya started teaching in the Mysore Palace, to bring it back to the roots of it, he taught, obviously we know, I mentioned it earlier, he taught young boys, right, between the ages of 12 and 17, 18, yeah? Brahmacharya boys, right? For the purposes of Brahmacharya, for keeping these kids in line, getting them on their studies, giving them some physical conditioning, and just keeping them on the straight and narrow, so they weren't going out doing what young teenage boys would do, right? They were Brahmacharya. So he, that was his job, right? So he taught dynamically for that reason, right? To, as you know, having a teenage boy, they're not going to sit around and just do a few asanas, right? But that was what Hatha Yoga was. So, we can infer that Krishnamacharya really made yoga dynamic in a way that it wasn't before. But the important thing, another important thing is, apart from his dynamism, he taught the boys individual series. Yeah? They were all dynamic, but they didn't all learn the same thing, depending on when they learnt with him, depending on their ability, because they still had different abilities, depending on how long they studied with him. He taught them different things, right? That was kind of natural, right? But, it was Joyce that came up with and really kind of patented the Ashtanga series as they were. Yeah? Krishnamacharya wasn't teaching the Ashtanga series. Let's get that clear. There is this myth that Krishnamacharya was teaching from the Yoga Karunta. You might have heard that. There was this mythical text. It was given to him by a Himalayan guru in the Himalayas, and he travelled there. It's like 7 years Tibet story, right? And he stayed there for 7 years, and he learnt it from this text. And it's all very pleasant, but latterly it seems that even Krishnamacharya kind of reneged on that story, that that it didn't actually happen that way, and no one's ever seen the Yoga Karunta, and you know what? Like there's documented evidence that he never actually taught these series in the Mysore Palace. He taught different, there's still a couple of people alive apart from Patabi Joyce. The thing is that Patabi Joyce, Krishnamacharya was a bit of a taskmaster, and he would be very tough with the boys. So in the end, there wasn't that many students left. Patabi Joyce being one of them, he was given the job of heading the yoga demonstrations. So that's where they came up with the sequences. You know, that's becoming increasingly accepted as the narrative. That between him and Krishnamacharya, they came up with the Yoga Ashtanga series because the other thing was that the Maharaja Mysore, who employed Krishnamacharya, employed him for one of the main reasons as promoting Indian physical culture for the purposes of political. There was a political agenda, you know, for the purposes of Indian independence, Indian pride, all the things that you do when you're trying to basically drum up a spirit of strength and courage and independence in a nation that's trying to assert themselves, right? You know, so it's really a bit like, you know, not exactly like, but a little bit like a fascist rally. You know, you have all the boys doing the same thing at the same time, and they all did the same thing, and there's a spirit of kind of like strength and a show of strength and a formidable kind of presentation if you get everyone doing the same thing at the same time. So that was really where the demonstrations came about. You know, Batavi Joyce and Krishnamacharya put together dynamic sequences, and they had to present almost I think every weekend these demonstrations out and around Mysore for the purposes of presenting a strong Indian culture like that. But there was never any kind of reference point really before that to the sequences, and you know, it's likely that Krishnamacharya had a hand in them, but he certainly didn't teach the sequences later. You know, I mean, if you think about let's take that narrative further again. If we go back and think, well, okay, Krishnamacharya, you know, taught vinyasa, and it's, you know, you have to know the right vinyasa because there's something kind of very special about the number of vinyasas in a posture and the number and doing the sequence in exactly the right way. Well, if that was the case, well, that guy would have carried on, Krishnamacharya that is, teaching that same thing when he left. But of course he didn't. When he left teaching the boys, when he went to Chennai and started teaching adults, he taught very differently. He taught individually, again, more remedially, more therapeutically, in the way he'd always taught. You know, because that was the way he actually taught yoga. You know, the job he'd been given, because the family, Krishnamacharya's family, needed money. You know, everyone needs money to live, and he had 8 kids. There was to teach the boys dynamically. So he kind of used the yoga background he had to come up with this idea to teach the people in front of him. So it was relevant to them, and it's not to say it wasn't relevant to anyone now. I mean, it was relevant to me. I come from a martial arts background, and I did this since I was 19. So it was relevant to me up to the age of 38, let's say, around that time. Yeah? Body shifts, body changes. For many bodies, it's never relevant for, you know, if you haven't got the background, and, you know, so you have to amend it to the person in front of you. You know, I suppose that's, you know, you're starting to get the idea now. That's the bottom line, you know, and to say that there's a precedent that, you know, that it comes from the Yoga Karunta and it was always this number of vinyasas and always this exact sequence as if you do it like a spell. It's like, oh, if you do the spell exactly right and you put all the snake's tails and the witch's hats in at the right time, at the right place, then something will happen, you know. But it doesn't work like that, you know. It's like, it's a method, it's an inner method, and it's just coat hangers. You know, all the postures are just coat hangers to put this inner technique on, really. You know, that's all it is. You know, and the whole thing has to flow and inspire you, you know, in the first place. Because if it's just hurting, and you know, you cannot have a chance in hell to do anything for yourself. You know, so. Just bear that in mind. The whole vinyasa thing, you know, let's look at that. Well, the vinyasa and the vinyasa count, you've heard of that, right? You know, I'd said a bit of that this morning, ekam inhale, dve exhale, and the way that the teachers often cling to that now and say, well, you know, if you don't know the vinyasas, then you're not doing it traditionally, and, you know, there's nothing special about the vinyasas. The only point, I mean, I often say that it was useful in the breach as the observance. You understand what the phrase means? The only important thing is you know when you're breathing, yeah? And if you know when you're, you know, if you're doing the vinyasa count right, or if you're adding extra breaths, you're doing it wrong, as long as you kind of roughly know that you're breathing, then that's the main thing, you know. It's not like you have to do it right. And some of the vinyasas are ridiculous. Jump through, do Marichasana D in one breath. Sapta, inhale, Marichasana D, one breath. I mean, you know, no one can do that, you know. Or you just hold your breath to such a degree, it would just be really unnatural, you know. So you know, the idea is it's just to give a general rhythm and to encourage you to focus on your breath again. Some things are useful, like to knowing when to inhale and exhale, because you've got the lift of the diaphragm, gives you certain lifts. When you put your hands down and lift up, the inhale helps you lift and the exhale helps you come down. So certain inhale breaths and exhales are useful, but the number of vinyasas and the litigiousness that's come around the vinyasa, again, I mean, that's a modern phenomenon. When Pattabhi Jois came over for the first time, and that was in 1976, I believe, to America, that was the first time that those students had ever heard mention of the vinyasa count. before that. And Lino Miele, who you might have heard, that guy, Mark mentioned him as a teacher. He's a formidable teacher, and he did this book called Ashtanga Yoga, and that's the first time, and one of the only books where you see the vinyasa count written down, as Pattabhi Jois did it. Shirak Jois has got a vinyasa count book, but the vinyasa, inevitably as it is Indian way, the vinyasas are not exactly the same as Pattabhi Jois's, which is interesting of itself. But leaving that aside, Lino Miele only heard that when Pattabhi Jois travelled outside of Mysore and came to do workshops in Lille in France, in the middle of France, and he heard this Pattabhi Jois counting these vinyasas. What's going on here? So that encouraged him to put the book together. But even that experience is interesting, because then the book became the gospel, right? The vinyasa count. You got to know the count. You got to know, But actually, the backstory is that he only became interested in that in the first place because he'd been doing it in Mysore without any knowledge of any of that before, right? So what I'm saying is, if that was so bloody important, why wasn't he taught like that in Mysore? Of course he wasn't. He was taught Mysore-style self-practice without emphasis on the count. It was only when Pattabhi Jois went in 1976 and when he travelled abroad, because he never did it in Mysore up until recently, the room wasn't big enough, he never did leads. He never did lead classes. So there was no vinyasa count. None of them learnt it. David Williams had never heard it until Pattabhi Jois comes to Hawaii, and he's got a big group, because the first time he comes to US, he's got a small group, so he teaches Mysore only. Second time he comes, too many people for the first week until he injures them all. True story. He has about 100, and then he has 20 left after the month. He has 20 people left because he's injured them all from adjusting them badly. Yeah. So, and that's true. And David Williams, the first person to do it, he says, I never liked adjustments. He said, it was always bad. I went as little as possible to Pattabhi Jois until I'd learnt the sequences because I was scared of getting injured. And in the end, he was injured anyways, But, that's the first guy that ever learnt these adjustments. And, I mean, Krishnamacharya was adjusting, of course, but he was adjusting young boys. You can adjust a young boy in anything. Do you know what I mean? And they were young, So, listen, when he goes out and he starts teaching the vinyasa count, that's the first time they've ever heard of it. So how important is it then, it just happens that this vinyasa, they'd been counted through when they did the demonstrations. Now, Pattabhi Jois takes these demonstrations and the sequences that he put together kind of as his own, yeah? And the counting as his own. So it's really Pattabhi Jois that starts the whole Ashtanga thing in the way that we know Ashtanga now. What I mean by that is defined by the series. Doesn't mean in the method we're learning that I'm trying to convey behind the series, behind the asanas, isn't the Krishnamacharya method, which Pattabhi Jois also conveys. There's still rudiments of that, but it's not, Ashtanga isn't defined exactly by the series or the count or the doing the posture right. It's defined by something that's carried on behind that, which Krishnamacharya was suggesting, and I think he was always teaching, right? What else can I say about it? Anything that I've raised yet that has been interesting to you in any manner? Have I left anything out? Yeah, sure.
So the people that came and became teachers after being in Mysore, were they accredited by Jois? Like, okay, you're ready, you go teach?
Yeah.
Is that how it worked?
Well, the first way that first person that was given the accreditation, well, he had a curriculum. He called it his yoga curriculum. And David Williams always said that Pattabhi Jois was really pleased because no one had completed the curriculum for 15 years before he'd come. Because Pattabhi Jois was teaching in the style that they would have learnt. You know what? Like, the thing with yoga in India is that the asana part is a small part because they've got a whole lifestyle involving in rituals and observances and the pujas, what we call devotional prayers. They happen all day, And so the asana part for the Indians was a small little body conditioning thing before they went to work. And of course the West, and when they went there originally, when the Westerners first landed, there was no opening prayer, there was no closing prayer. You just did it, got up, went away. And that was all there was it to. There was no making a whole meal out of it because it was just your asana practice. That was part of the whole of the yoga kind of thing, Part of the body cleansing, part of it, but not all of it. And because the Westerners had nothing else really, I think they made a lot more out of it, So, yeah, so what I was going to say is that, when Pattabhi Jois was teaching it to the Indians, he was teaching on, they were just a bit sloppy. They weren't just that, they weren't pushing themselves that much. They were just normal people going to work afterwards. And then the Westerners came and you had these people that weren't working. They were younger, and they were really, really into the asana part, which just wasn't, Pattabhi Jois's experience up until that point when he was teaching, right? So suddenly you had these people that really wanted to go through the sequences that hadn't happened for many years. And so he started being excited. I mean, basically what you got is this guy who's basically just on the cusp of retirement. He suddenly retires and he finds that, oh wow, there's all these people interested in this thing that I learnt when I was young, and he's kind of excited to teach them it again. Like it's just, I always say it's like kind of going down to the garage or your old man cave and pulling out all your records when you're young again and going through it with someone who's really interested in it. I think he kind of felt like that, like he hadn't got the chance to do all this rigorous stuff that he'd done when he was young, and the people he was teaching were just doing a little asana and going to work, and they had their pujas, and they have how you have your family guru, and it's a very different structure in India, right? But suddenly there's these Westerners, they don't have any of that, and they've got the asana, and they just want to go as far through it as they can. So he starts pushing them, and he starts, kind of doing all the sequences again, and the first person to qualify those series, the 4 series, was David Williams. And when he'd done the 4, and he was given the title, David Williams always said, I was called a yoga master. He said I was a yoga master, and I didn't have to return again. And he's very pleased, and he never did. And that's funny, isn't it? So he was always, kind of rather skeptical of many of Joyce's methods of teaching, But yeah, he was given a little shawl and a plinth, a little plinth, and Pattabhi Jois said, "I'll put this over the door of wherever you teach and call it Ashtanga Yoga so and so." So something's never changed, Ashtanga Yoga, wherever your town is, and just teach what you've been taught. But there was no ceremony around it. He was just given that orally. So the first person to actually get a certificate was Tim Miller, because Tim Miller asked for, "Can I have a certificate of teaching?" And Pattabhi just said, "All right, then I'll knock one up for you. I'll get the typist out there. We'll say that, we'll give you a certificate, And it went like that, And he just got the certificate of learning. Originally, you had to have completed that yoga curriculum, the A series, the B series, and the intermediate and the primary. Yeah. And then it changed over the years. So gradually it became divided, so you could be authorized and certified. You might know the authorized now is divided further. You could be authorized level 1, authorized level 2, depending on whether you've completed the primary and the second series, right? But it became, that became more and more definite over the years. So before, in the 90s, it would just be like, it was kind of like a bit of a funny situation, that because Pattabhi Jois used to teach a conference every afternoon. He used to have a yoga conference, so he just used to sit there reading the paper, because he couldn't remember. That's one thing of Pattabhi Jois which is different to Iyengar, and one reason why Iyengar has been taught a lot different, because Jois didn't speak English. Iyengar, BKS Iyengar did speak English well. He learnt it from. In fact, Iyengar was helped to learn it from. What's his name? Krishnamurti. He was a good friend of Krishnamurti's. So he learnt English, and he learnt a very different westernized way of relating to people. Whereas Pattabhi Jois stayed in India, and he didn't learn English. So Shrat used to sit next to him and interpret what Pattabhi Jois would say. And in the conferences, after the conference, he would look at someone and he says, you teach. And they would say, "No, I'm not teaching. And he'd go, "No, you teach," like that, And that was the way that people got authorized in that time, really. They just got what was called the blessing to teach, which was just, he would say to you, "You can teach now," And it was that simple. And then you used to have to come back every 2 years and redo. In the end, they got certificates, and you could redo your certificates. In the first place, there wasn't certificates, so many teachers like David Swenson, he's never been certified, never been authorized, never got a piece of paper. Although he was there from the early 70s, because there were never that kind of a certification process. Right? But much has been made around it, and again, a lot of it's business interest, and different people have tried to do different things and stop people. I mean, there was a whole lobby of the Japanese teachers trying to make Western teachers that went to Japan pay them a percentage of their income that they'd earned in Japan to the Japanese teachers. All teachers have tried all this stuff, over the years of controlling the ways that it's been taught. Tim Miller, in fact, came up with this idea, like a tithe system. So no one took it up apart from him, that you would teach and you would pay a percentage of your income earned to Pattabhi Jois. I think he was the only one that ever really did that. But that was the way that different people have tried to kind of control the whole business in different ways. So it's nothing wrong with that. I feel it's kind of funny in a way, but we just have to recognise that there's been always been corporate influences on what we've been doing, because, that's how we thrive. That's we're set up on a political economic system, so anything has to be incorporated into that structure that's taken on into society, right? The certification has become more formalized, and now you have this whole rigmarole. Basically, now it's just as simple as you go to Mysore 3 times and you get the certificate, and then if you do intermediate as well, then you get the certificate authorized level 2, Yeah. Huh? Yeah, you have to pay. You'd have to pay. You didn't have to pay originally, yeah. So it was free originally. None of them paid. Yeah, you just got it. And now, if you're certified, that means you have to go to Mysore, like over 12 trips, I think, at least, and then you have to complete the advanced series. So I'm blowing my own trumpet, but I completed that advanced series in 3 trips. I couldn't fathom going another 8 trips or something to go. I asked people, okay, I've done the advanced A. Well, that's the qualification of certification. And I thought, okay, maybe I'm on the agenda. And so I said, I've done the advanced A, so how long do I have to keep going to Mysore to get the certification? And they were like, well, so-and-so, he's been going like for 12 years now and he hasn't got it. So I thought, fuck that. I mean, Mysore, like some people love it, but, it's a landlocked town of India. Like, there's nothing to do there. Like, you have to go for months at a time, and, 3 times was enough for me. Well, we went more than 3 times, but, yeah, I wasn't going to go for years and years and years to get that certification process. And I think you have to pay now. I don't know. No one really wants to say how much the certification is, but I reckon it's over 10,000 euros, $20,000, I'd say. It's a very, very costly, yeah? Authorization is a couple grand. Level 1 is cheaper. I think Teresa got level 1. It was like 800 euros or something. I got level 2. I had to pay like 1,500 euros or something like that, I don't remember. I thought it was a good deal at the time. Anyways, well, what else is there? Changes to the original sequence. I've got this. If I had the projector, I'd keep more on task. So I told you the backbends were at the end. The series were, if the series was so important, then why did they change? Come on, why did they change? Why were they divided up? Why was the advanced series changed in the 1990s to a completely different advanced series? Yeah, the intermediate series has had changes. It's had changes made to it. Even if you look at the vinyasa in Lino Miele's book and you look at Sharat's vinyasa, there's changes. He rolls the vinyasa, so Baddha Konasana and the closing sequence, for example, they're rolled together. Yeah, so it counted like 9, 10, 11 instead of counted back to 7 every time. Yeah. Anyways, you don't need to know that really, but the vinyasas have changed. And the way of teaching has changed, right? Originally they would hold postures for a lot longer. So if you had a posture you were struggling with, you'd hold it for 10, 20, 30 breaths. Some teachers were kept in there for some minutes in a posture. Yeah. My teacher's wife, Joanne Darby, I told you my teacher was Mark Darby, she would famously did a headstand there for an hour. She would do an hour's headstand a day. Now, the reason for that was basically that Patabi Joyce told her to do headstand, and then he went upstairs to have a cup of tea, and he forgot about her. And she felt that she should stay in it until he came and saw her again. So he didn't come down for an hour. So she stayed in it, and when he came down, he said, "Oh, very good." And and there was that guru thing going on. Remember, it was the 1970s, right? Everyone wanted a guru, right? So they were happy to take him as a guru, right? And so they said, okay, he's the guru saying that, so we'll do what he says. He must know. And of course he knew things. He was a smart guy, but he didn't know everything, of course. That was found out later. So she did that every day. Then, she would incorporate an hour's headstand every day in the practice. And different people like. For example, I told you Mark Darby, he was very proficient in the asanas, so he came up with this crazy idea. He's Australian, by the way, native Australian. And he came up with this crazy idea that he would do a handstand over to a back bend, and a back bend over to a handstand, and then come back round, if you can imagine, from the handstand down to a forward fold. And every posture in the primary, he would do that. He would jump from downward dog to handstand, to back bend, up into handstand, and then into the next posture, you can see, right? And he did that through every posture until he got too tired and he hurt his shoulder and he didn't do it anymore. And then Batabi Joy said, oh, good. We never told him not to do it, you know, because that the Indian way is you don't really, you know, it's like you don't spoon feed, you know, you just kind of allow people enough rope to hang themselves with, really, you know. So, you know, a lot of things were tolerated in that room. You know, Janu C. Darby had this idea. He saw someone when he was a beginner student. He saw Norman Allen rolling over the foot during the advanced one, where you roll over the foot. So he started to do that to himself every day in the primary series, right? And he hurt his knees. But no one ever told him not to do it, you know. So I think, you know, you've got to recognise that, you know, in the early days it was called, and Batabi Joyce called his early centre the Research Institute. Yeah? So David Swenson always has this, he likes, you know, kind of like, I don't say cliches, but he likes sound bites, David Swenson. He used to say, we were the guinea pigs, you know, we were the research students, you know. They were researched on and people were given, as I told you, different things. It was just a little bit of a like, let's see what we can do here, because that was the idea with the Hatha Yoga in the first place. And it's become something a little bit different, I suppose. Another thing which is of interest perhaps to you was they would the main condition was they had to sign up for a month when they went in their 70s, and they had to sign up for 2 practices a day. So if you can imagine, you do everything you've done in the morning, and in the afternoon you have to come back for a whole other practice and do it twice a day. So they would practice the primary and the second in the morning and the advanced series in the afternoon, every single day, you know. And in the early days, without the moon sequence, they'd take a day or 2 off at the weekends. I think they would maybe take 2 days off at the weekends. I have to get clear. But the series with the whole moon days, that came later. You know, not because of the waters in the body. It just became. It's just, you know, that's all it was. You know, a lot of this stuff we say, oh, this or that, or if you you do the left before the right because of this or that reason. It's just folklore etymology, you say, because there's no, you know, the reason of the moon days was that Batabi Joyce had a lot of stuff to do around the moon. It's important in ceremonial reasons. You do a lot of pujas around the moon. So those days were busy. So the family said, take those days off. You know, you're too busy. So you took the moon days off, the new moon and the dark moon, and they became the moon days, not because of the waters of your body pulling your body in certain ways.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Because it's interesting. Obviously, I mean, here in our school, we're like so playful, we do all sorts of things. We do a bit of Ashtanga, we do that and this and that. And it seems to, I mean, we've got a very low level of injuries, but students are pretty advanced too, you know, but it's extremely playful. But then you go to Ashtanga, and it's always to like a really dedicated Ashtanga school. In Berlin, people get screamed at and kicked and barked at, and it's this way and that way, and they're all angry, and it's, you know, and it's you have to enter this posture this way, and there's no other way of doing it, and this and that. And I understand it gives people a structure, and the structure is helpful because we all need something to cling on, because otherwise we're lost. So if you tell someone do A, B, C, D, A, and so on and so forth, we've got something to go by, rather than taking a book with 10,000 postures. And
What do you do?
Yeah, what's your thought on this? What's right or wrong? It's kind of like as a teacher, I'm sometimes a little bit like I make it up as I go. I trust my gut, but I'm also have this innate feeling of inadequacy sometimes because if you meet someone who is triple certified, you look like an idiot. You know, you look like an absolute idiot. And you can say, "Oh, I've been teaching for 10 years, but I'm still an idiot in their eyes." You know, so, what's your opinion on that?
I think, I felt that, you know, before I started going to Mysore and doing all that stuff, I also felt inadequate because those teachers will always make you feel that because it's, you know, they put the time in and it's business, isn't it, you know, so they're promoting their thing and one of the main things is they've been to Mysore and they've done it, you know, which is, you know, if you've had to go to Mysore and do it, and it's hard, you know, it is hard, you know, it is a sacrifice, obviously it's a privilege as well, but, you know, it's hard, it's a sacrifice, and, you know, we sacrificed many years to go to Mysore and we didn't do many things and you know and spent all our money going to Mysore where we could have bought a house, blah blah blah, you know, like it was a, you know, we you know, me and Teresa, we spent a lot of our life, you know, going there. So, you know, there is an investiture in there and somewhat, but I mean I really come out the other side there, and I do see that as a little bit of control and culty and you know, and I feel that there's, I think it's a pragmatic teaching method rather than the gospel, and I think that the point of the repetition, as Mark points out, following a sequence is useful. It's useful as a teaching modality because I think the main thing Ashtanga has going for it is that it's a self-practice routine. I think that's the main reason why I stick at it, because I think self-practice, you wouldn't want to do a lead class and that's all you know as yoga. You have to do it on your own, get into your breathing, have a private experience. I think that's super important. And that's the only yoga that does it. So that's why I've always stuck with Ashtanga, because it's the only yoga that really prioritizes self-practice. But to that end, well, if you're going to do self-practice and have everyone in the room doing their own completely individualized practice, it's just going to be chaos, isn't it? You're not going to know where they're doing or what they're doing today or what they're doing tomorrow, or so you have to have everyone roughly doing the same thing, And in my room, if I have it, it's not like everyone's doing exactly the same thing, but it's useful as a teaching modality to help everyone, because it's collective. One, you have a collective spirit. Everyone feels that they're doing something kind of together rather than everyone doing their own things completely. There's left collectivity, and I think the collectivism helps us, we're always group animals. We've done everything, as a ritual, and, when we did that dance originally, I think in the primitive ancestry, it was always collective. I think there's something about a collective spirit of doing something together. So there's that. And I think as a teacher, going around and having everyone roughly, okay, they're going to do that next, they're going to do, it kind of helps, and makes it a lot easier to teach, yeah? And the repetition, it's useful to repeat the series. It's useful because you understand the movements better, rather than do this today, that tomorrow, So I think it's a pragmatic reasons rather than, this whole thing of, you're not really an Ashtanga teacher because you don't know exactly how it's done in Mysore and you know the exact vinyasa counts. That's just business protectionism in my mind, I mean, and the relevance of that exact Ashtanga method is relevant to only such a few students, really. I mean, now I love it, don't get me wrong. It's like, it's like me. It's like me going down to my man cave and, if there's a student that's really into it and they like the little details and this or that, and they can do it, I super loved going back into that because that was my 20s and 30s, and learning it in that such a rigorous and advanced way, and they can do all this and that and advanced series. I still love teaching it, but for most people, that's not the experience they're having and they're going to have, so you have to make it more appropriate and realistic to the real people.